The vexed Threlon ambassador's hands were shaking. Not from fear of a weapon, the humans standing before the grand convocation of the Sundered Compact carried no weapon at all, but from the sheer, impossible silence that had fallen over 300 delegates from 41 star systems. "Say that again," rasped Chief Arbiter Osun, her chitin plates rattling with static discharge. "Say it again so the recorders do not mistake this for a translation error." The human, a woman named Reyes Calloway with gray in her hair and old scars on her knuckles, did not raise her voice. "We didn't build a weapon," she said. "We built a promise, and we're going to keep it, whether you vote yes or not." The chamber erupted. Somewhere in the gallery, a Krythan diplomat fainted clean off his perch. The Empire's Supreme Fleet Marshal, Grand Admiral Ves Kathrun, rose so fast his ceremonial cloak tore against the podium's edge. "Impossible," he said. "You are bluffing." But he already knew, in the cold pit of his enormous chest, that humans did not bluff about the things that mattered most. None of this had begun that way. 3 days earlier, the human science vessel, Quiet Persistence, had drifted into orbit around the dying star system of Ithreka Vor, with its running lights dimmed and its weapons, such as they were, fully powered down. It was, by any galactic military standard, an act of suicidal stupidity. The Sundered Compact had blockaded Ithreka Vor for 6 years, starving out a rebellion of enslaved Threllan miners, who had dared ask for the right to breathe unfiltered air on their own moons. Reyes Calloway was not a soldier. She was a hydrologist, 48 years old, who had spent her career coaxing water out of dead worlds. She had volunteered for this mission because Earth's ambassadors, 3 years into first contact, had learned one crucial fact about the wider galaxy. The compact ran on scarcity: water, air, soil, fuel. Everything was hoarded, taxed, rationed, weaponized. An empire built on chains needed its subjects thirsty enough to obey. Humanity had spent 2 centuries learning to grow gardens on Mars and pull rivers out of asteroids. Nobody in the compact had thought to ask what that meant. The first alien to challenge her ship was a young Threllan patrol commander named Eo Vantresh, barely out of his hatching cohort, piloting a scout skiff so old its hull sang when it turned. He hailed the Quiet Persistence expecting to find smugglers, or worse, spies for the compact sent to entrap the last free miners before the blockade tightened for good. Instead he found Reyes, sitting cross-legged on her cargo bay floor, sorting seed packets. "You're supposed to be terrifying," Sayo said, when the translation matrix finally stabilized. "The reports called your species monstrous, cunning, merciless." "We're mostly just tired," Reyes said. "Tired of watching people go thirsty when the fix isn't hard. Just expensive, if you're the kind of empire that likes people staying thirsty." That wasn't even the biggest surprise. Io expected a trick. He got instead 4 tons of atmospheric condensers, a portable desalination rig older than his own government's oldest treaty, and a woman who insisted on personally walking his engineers through the schematics. No proprietary locks, no leverage, no strings. "Why?" he asked her, 3 days into the installation, watching moisture bead on the inside of a machine that should not have worked on Threllan alloys at all. "What does your species want in return?" Reyes considered the question the way she considered a stubborn irrigation problem. "We want to be the kind of neighbors worth having," she said. "That's it, that's the whole plan." The council had made a terrible mistake in assuming this was charity with a hidden cost, and an even bigger one in assuming word wouldn't travel. It traveled in 6 days flat. By the time Grand Admiral Ves Kathrun heard of it, 3 more mining colonies along the blockade line had quietly petitioned for the same human water miracle, and compact tax revenue from Ithreka Vor's forced mineral quotas had cratered by 11%. The old admiral, a war hero from the Threllan subjugation campaigns 80 years prior, did what any good servant of a scarcity empire would do. He requested the humans be summoned to explain themselves before the full convocation, and quietly ordered a strike wing to make certain the Quiet Persistence never left Ithreka Vor's system to tell anyone else how it was done. Nobody knew what the human was hiding, and that unsettled Ves more than any weapon could have. His entire career had been built on reading an enemy's strength by the size of its guns. Humans had none worth speaking of. And yet 3 of his own systems had begun asking, in low voices in mess halls and mining tunnels, whether there might be another way to live. Before the strike wing ever arrived, there was the matter of Dr. Sella Marn. Sella was the Compact's regional trade auditor for Ithrika Vor, a Krythan bureaucrat with 4 elegant limbs and a reputation for finding creative ways to make quotas that couldn't be met on paper anyway. She arrived aboard a modest courier ship 2 days after Reyes's condensers went online, expecting to fine the miners for unauthorized resource generation, a charge invented, on the spot, because no law had ever anticipated water simply appearing where there hadn't been enough of it before. What she found instead was children playing in puddles that had not existed in living memory, and old Threllan miners weeping into cups they didn't have to ration. This is illegal, Sella told Reyes, reviewing regulation after regulation on a data slate that trembled slightly in her grip. There is no tariff code for this. There is no precedent. Good, Reyes said. Write a new one. Call it the human tariff. Rate 0. Sella did not laugh, though something in her 4 eyes suggested she wanted to. Instead, she did something far more dangerous to the Compact than any weapon could have. She filed an honest report. Every condenser, every leader, every child's face. She sent it up the chain not as an act of rebellion, but out of a bureaucrat's stubborn devotion to the truth, never once suspecting that truth would detonate harder than any bomb. It reached Grand Admiral Ves Cothron's desk 4 hours before his strike wing translated into the Ithrika Vor system, and it was that report, not fear of human weapons, that convinced him this had to be crushed quickly, quietly, before the rest of the Compact read it too. The strike wing arrived at Ithrika Vor 40 hours later, 11 warships translating out of subspace in a formation meant to be seen, meant to be feared. Eo Vantresh's little scout skiff was the first thing they encountered, hanging uselessly between the warships and the human vessel, like a child stepping between 2 duelists. Stand down, Ves broadcast, or your colony forfeits its water rights for a generation. It was Reyes who answered, not Eo. Her voice, calm and even, filled every bridge in the strike wing. Admiral, before you do anything you can't undo, you should know 2 things. First, that condenser rig isn't the only thing we brought. Second, we've already given the schematics to every ship in this system, human and Threllan both, 40 minutes ago. There's nothing left here to destroy that isn't already everywhere. The Queen suddenly froze. Not literally. For there was no Queen in that chamber, but 3 systems away. In the glittering ice palace of Serion Prime, Compact Sovereign Ithana Corel received the report and went utterly still, because she understood immediately what her admiral had not. Information, once freed, could not be recaged, not even by the sundered Compact's entire battle fleet. Everything changed in the next few seconds. Ves ordered the strike wing to power weapons. It was, in his mind, the only language left. But when his gunnery officer relayed targeting locks to the fleet's central array, half the ships reported a fault. Not sabotage, not a virus, but a refusal so quiet it took engineers hours to even locate its source. 3 of the 11 vessels were crewed, in part, by Threllan conscripts. And Threllan conscripts, it turned out, had spent the last 6 days listening to their cousins on Ithrika Vor talk about clean water for the first time in a generation. They simply did not fire. It was in that silence that Ves Cathron's own tactical officer, a hard-eyed Threllan-born loyalist named Corvain Dresh, made his move. Dresh had spent 30 years earning his rank by being the one soldier in any room who would do what needed doing when others hesitated. He crossed the bridge in 4 strides, drew a service sidearm, and leveled it not at the viewscreen showing the human ship, but at Ves Cathron himself. You're going to give the order to withdraw, Dresh said, voice shaking with something between grief and fury. My sister lives on Ithrika Vor. She drank clean water for the first time in 9 years last week. I will not let you take that from her to save your career. For a long moment, nobody on the bridge breathed. Ves Cathron, who had faced down pirate fleets and rebel armadas without flinching, found himself staring down the barrel of his own officer's weapon and felt, for the first time in decades, something close to relief. Stand down, Commander, he said quietly. Not because you're pointing that at me. Because you're right. He turned back to the comm array before Dresch could lower the weapon, and gave the order himself. Full stand down, weapons cold, strike wing recalled to formation. It was the last order Vescathron would ever give as Grand Admiral, though he did not know that yet. Vescathron stood on his flagship bridge, staring at a mutiny his own tactical officer had started for him, and understood with the clarity of a man 40 years past the age of illusions that his empire's real weakness had never been human technology. It had been thirst. The truth stunned the entire galaxy within the week, once the story reached the compact's outer relay networks, embellished and re-embellished until it barely resembled what had actually happened at Ithreka Vor. A human woman had faced down 11 warships with nothing but a water filter and a stubborn refusal to be afraid. The convocation, desperate to control the narrative before it spiraled further, summoned the quiet Persistence crew to explain themselves formally, expecting either groveling apology or a demand for territory, tribute, some galactic currency of power they could understand and negotiate against. What they got, instead, was Reyes Calloway standing in the well of their grandest chamber, plainly dressed, hands scarred from decades of fieldwork, telling 300 delegates that Earth had built nothing more dangerous than a promise, and intended to keep it. "We didn't come here to conquer you," she said, into that ringing silence. "We came because we've been where you are. Earth used to fight wars over water too, over air, over dirt that wouldn't grow anything. We nearly ended ourselves twice before we figured out the trick isn't hoarding what's scarce. It's making it not scarce anymore. That knowledge is the only weapon we've got, and we're handing it out for free, to anyone who wants it, compact citizen, rebel miner, even you, Admiral Cathron, if your world ever runs dry." Vescathron, watching from the gallery with the wreckage of his career and his convictions, both laid bare before the convocation, found he had no counter-argument left. He had spent his life certain that an empire's strength was measured in warships. He was only now understanding, far too late for his own comfort, that it was measured in how many of its own people it had to keep desperate to survive. The chief arbiter called for a vote on formal sanctions against the human delegation for destabilizing interspecies economic order. It failed, 41 systems to 6, the largest margin any resolution had seen in compact history. Because 35 systems representatives had, in the last week, quietly received their own water miracle, and were not about to vote to make themselves thirsty again. Dr. Selamarn was summoned before the convocation as well, to explain why a compact auditor had filed a report legitimizing an unauthorized human incursion. She stood small among the towering delegates, 4 eyes unblinking, data slate clutched in trembling limbs, and delivered the only defense she had ever needed. "I audited what I found," she said. "I found children with water. I found no crime in that. No matter how many statutes I searched, if this body wishes to punish me for telling the truth, it should first explain why the truth was so dangerous to it." No charges were filed. 6 months later, Selamarn would be appointed the Compact's first Commissioner of Resource Equity, a post that had not existed before Ithreka Vor, and would not have existed without her. Eo Vantresh, invited to speak as the first Threlan witness to the Ithreka Vor incident, stood before the same chamber that had once condemned his people to 6 years of blockade, and said the only thing that felt true. "I thought humans would be monsters, because that's what monsters we were told to fear," he said. "Instead they gave us water and asked for nothing. I don't know what that makes them. But it isn't an empire. And it isn't a threat, it's just neighbors, finally worth having." Grand Admiral Vescathrun resigned his commission 3 days later. He did not return home. Instead, quietly, without ceremony, he asked to join the engineering crews now spreading water technology across the Compact's driest worlds. An old soldier learning, at last, how to build instead of blockade, Reyes Calloway never gave a farewell speech. She simply packed her seed packets, thanked Eo Vantresh for his hospitality, and pointed the quiet Persistence toward the next dying world that needed a promise kept. The sundered compact would spend the next decade arguing over what to call what had happened at Ithreka Vor. An invasion, a revolution, a miracle, a mistake, but on 100 worlds where children drank clean water for the first time in living memory, they had already given it a simpler name. They called it The Day the Humans Came, and nobody went thirsty again.